this time, and that we're rooted in terms of what folk have to say to us in Jerusalem. And I'll get Jeff to try and play this.
What would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. One, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe, especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive immigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, it was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government. While over 100,000 of their relatives and neighbors who hadn't left became second-class citizens of the new state, along with the new Jewish majority. Today, Palestinian refugees and their descendants number in the millions. Most are in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jordan. Many are spread throughout the world, with millions still living in refugee camps, seeking to return to their homeland. To sum up, one group of refugees found a much-needed home, but in the process, a new group of refugees was created. Here's the second thing to understand. Israel was founded as a Jewish state, but now ask yourself, what exactly does that mean? People had lots of ideas about what a Jewish state should look like. Some called for equality for all citizens. But what was created in practice was institutional discrimination against non-Jews. In other words, Israel ended up being built on a blueprint of exclusion. The Israeli government wants maximum land and resources for Jews, but not the Palestinians living there. That's why inside Israel, Jews get special privileges, including rights to land and housing, that are denied to the Palestinian citizens, who make up 20% of Israel's population. That's also part of why Israel has never defined its borders. In fact, they still hold on to land, the West Bank and Gaza, that they conquered in the war in 1967. Since then, Israel has built Jewish settlements throughout the occupied West Bank, building Jewish-only cities and supplying them with infrastructure like roads and army camps, schools, and even a college. Military occupations are meant to be temporary, but after 40-plus years, this one looks permanent and entirely unjust. In the West Bank, Israeli Jewish settlers and Palestinians live on the same land, but must live under two completely separate and unequal systems of Israeli law. The Jewish settlers dominate the natural resources, including water and agricultural land, and they're backed by the Israeli army. To maintain the occupation, Israel has demolished thousands of Palestinian homes and orchards, confiscated Palestinian land, bombed a captive civilian population in Gaza, and punished resistance with raids, arrests, and assassinations, all to gain maximum land while making life so difficult for Palestinians that they will either leave or be too afraid to resist. Palestinians have fought back. For decades, they tried to achieve national liberation through armed struggle. Some groups still do, but the majority now support popular protest instead. The deeply harmful pattern of control, repression, and violence profoundly harms Palestinians living under occupation and Israelis living as occupiers. This must be broken to reach a peaceful and secure future for both peoples. Now that you understand the problem, what about the solution? What about peace talks? So far, over 2 decades of US-backed peace talks have actually made things worse by helping Israel continue the occupation. It's been years of talking while Israel massively expanded the Jewish settlements and literally redrew the map. Peace talks are good if they're real, but not when they're theater to cover a land grab. So now what? The current world superpower, the United States, has been a terrible friend, enabling Israel's destructive and self-destructive expansion onto Palestinian land by funding the Israeli military, the biggest recipient of US foreign aid in the world. But there's another superpower that can make the difference: you. There's a movement with hundreds of thousands of people just like you across the world, including Palestinians and Israelis, protesting, educating, divesting, and boycotting, all to bring nonviolent international pressure on Israel to stop violating human rights of Palestinians. Throughout history, where governments have failed to push for justice, people just like you, like us, have taken the lead and won. Now it's the Palestinians' turn for freedom and justice. We can pressure Israel to end the occupation and the discrimination. We want all people, Jews and Palestinians, to have equality, human rights, and democracy. We can change history. Join us.
So I talked a bit about Kairos, the Kairos Declaration, Christian churches in Palestine calling for people to come and witness and act. And this is a video I put together for our church as we have our own internal conversations about what we should be doing as a church. So what I'm saying sometimes doesn't actually reflect what's said in the pictures. So you might have to divide your brain to watch it. We'll see.
Hi friends, my name is Keith Simmons. I'm a diaconal minister serving in Duncan, BC on Vancouver Island. We're located within the unceded traditional territory of the Cowichan tribes, a Coast Salish community an hour north of Victoria. We learned a great deal from Cowichan elders and continue to walk the ways of reconciliation. In January and February of 2020, I served as an ecumenical accompanier, or a human rights observer, in Palestine and Israel for the World Council of Churches. Stationed in Bethlehem, I was part of a 4-person team called to observe, record, and report on the effect and impact and actions of the government of Israel's occupation of Palestine. Everything I saw supports the declarations made by Jewish Israeli human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and churches, unions, South African activists, and others. Israel and Palestine are governed by a regime using the tools of apartheid to delegitimize, dehumanize, and achieve the destruction of an ethnicity, indigenous Palestinians, they see as unworthy of basic human rights. Israel's government confiscates Palestinian resources, takes Palestinian land, destroys Palestinian houses and schools, businesses, and infrastructure, shoots Palestinian demonstrators, and unleashes armed occupiers on Palestinian children with the full support and protection of the Israeli military. I have witnessed the daily presence of fully armed, combat-ready Israeli soldiers looming over the paths of Palestinian children as they walk to school. I have witnessed homes destroyed and families broken by Israeli military who routinely enter Palestinian homes, in Bethlehem refugee camps, and in Palestinian villages to take Palestinian children. I have witnessed Palestinian water confiscated by Israel for Israeli use. I have seen Palestinian villages ringed by illegal Israeli colonies whose occupants routinely destroy Palestinian crops, cut down Palestinian trees, and pollute Palestinian water with their sewage outfalls. I have witnessed Palestinian teachers trying to help their students process the death of friends shot by Israeli military forces for demonstrating against the occupation. I have seen the ongoing humiliation of thousands of Palestinian workers paying half their wages for permits to work in Israel, waiting for hours in rain and cold for the privilege of passing through Israeli checkpoints reminiscent of cattle chutes. I have spoken with many Jewish Israeli Palestinian Muslim, and Christian peace activists who are working for this to end. All of them told me the only way to change the policies of the government of Israel is to stop supporting them. Our government is a friend to Israel, perhaps because we are also a colonial government with an apartheid history, perhaps because we vote in favor of Israel and against Palestine on almost every UN resolution. The path to change in Israel and in Palestine to equality and justice for all peoples relies heavily on the work and efforts of peacemakers and human rights activists everywhere. It relies on us. It's time we stopped accepting our designation, as one Palestinian told me, as America Light, and took up the cause of genuine peace, the resistant peace of Christ, not the armed peace of Rome or Israel or America. Thank you so much for listening.
Now, when you first get to Bethlehem, you're often encouraged to go to a place. On my first trip there, I was part of a come and see tour that United Church puts on with Mariana Harris and others. And our guide said, who was a Palestinian guide, out of something like, I want to get this number right, probably won't, 6,000 licensed tourist guides in Israel and Palestine, 50 are Palestinian. They don't really want Palestinians telling their story too much. So our tour guide was Palestinian. He had a bit of an Arabic accent. And so when we were driving into Bethlehem, he said, the first place we're going to is the Waldorf Hotel. And I thought, no, Waldorf? There's a Waldorf? He said, no, we're going to the Walled-Off Hotel. And I thought, Walled-Off Hotel? What the heck's that about? And so we got there, and somebody named Banksy, who's a satiric artist who does incredible art, that he's like a political cartoonist, only he does it large, and particularly on the separation wall in Bethlehem and elsewhere. Banksy, who nobody really knows, apparently his actual identity, we think he's a British artist, but we're not too sure. And that's probably a good thing for Banksy. Israel and others have a history of not treating critics very well. And so it's more than an art thing that keeps Banksy's identity quiet. It's also his desire to continue living. Anyway, at the Waldorf Hotel, in the front of the Waldorf Hotel, when you go in, there is, in kind of Banksy Palestinian humor, there's a bellhop dressed in red with a cap like bellhops have, but it's a monkey, a chimpanzee actually. And they can hear Banksy in there and Palestinians saying, see, when you're Israeli, this is what you see when you look at a Palestinian. This is not who we are, but this is what you see. And Banksy's art and Palestinian humor is all about poking the balloon. And it's an honor-shame culture. It's not the same culture as us. So we are in a guilt-based culture, Baltic culture, Northern European, North American culture. It means that our motivation's more around personal guilt. It means that, well, somebody told me the best way to understand it is just think about how your mother got you to do anything, and you'll understand you're in a guilt-based culture. You know, I'm sorry that I had to do that, but in an honor-shame culture, family relationships are everything. And certainly in Bethlehem and in the communities around Bethlehem, in the villages there, everybody's related to everybody. It's always like talking to Indigenous community here. Before you can have a fruitful conversation with Indigenous elders in this community and in most that I've been in, first you'll hear about who's related to who. Where are people connected? Who has a relative in Bella Coola, Bella Bella, who has one on Haida Gwaii, how they relate, who has the ancestral names, and you'll hear all of those connection pieces because it's really important to understand the connections and how people relate to one another and how people know one another through those relationships. Well, in Palestine, it's like that. Family relationships are everything. It's an honor-shame culture. If you did something that shamed your family, it would mean that your whole family relationship might suffer. Your brothers and sisters might not be able to be as well married or partnered in business as they could have been because you are a shameful family. You have no honor. You have to have honor to be anywhere, and your whole family's honor depends on the honors of the individual. And there's lots of stuff going on in that culture I completely don't understand or don't get. But in honor-shame culture, I can see that in Palestine, when Israel has destroyed something like 20,000 Palestinian homes, I didn't see any homeless people. And the reason I didn't see any homeless people was because in the context of an honor-shame culture, you didn't let your family go homeless. You found a way. There were 20 people living in one room. That's the way that was. You figured that out. But in Tel Aviv and in West Jerusalem, I saw homeless people because there's more of a European culture happening there in Europeans coming in from North America and from Europe. And you don't carry the shame of homelessness in the same way. I kind of wondered how I could transfer shame to Canada so we could start worrying about homeless people. But in the context of an honor shame culture, when you see things on the walls that poke at you, then there's a whole thing going on there. There's a whole subtext conversation happening about how Palestinians see the honor of Israelis. And you can see that and hear that everywhere when they talk about agreements or lack of agreements or broken agreements or bad faith. They talk about that. But they also talk about the wall. It's both a physical presence and a series of regulations, recommendations, and paperwork that determines where Palestinians can live, work, and travel. The Israeli government calls its segregation policy hafrada, separation. The UN calls any system of racial segregation apartheid, apartness, and regards it as a crime against humanity. And certainly everywhere you go in Palestine, if you're traveling on Palestinian transportation devices, which are quite interesting, actually. If I wanted to catch a bus to Ramallah from Bethlehem, I would go to a parking garage and there would be a series of brightly painted yellow vans. And you just get in a van, and once it's full, it takes off and another van pulls in and takes its place. There's no regular kind of bus that goes, just you get into these vans, you pool your resources. It costs X amount to go. The van waits a certain period of time. If there aren't enough people, then it divides whatever it costs amongst the people that there are, and it goes anyway. And so if you're driving down the road in a Palestinian van and an Israeli military detachment decides to stop you, they do. And then you come out and you show your identification. If you're an international, I was an international, you have an international passport, you're usually treated okay. But if you're a Palestinian, maybe you are, maybe you aren't. You can be held up and delayed for hours. You could be on your way trying to make your way into a healthcare facility with a very sick child. It doesn't really matter. The whole idea is to block you and hold you and let you know that you are of no consequence. And living in the shadow of those rules and regulations is part of the constant, well thought out and well considered approach of the government of Israel to keep a people under occupation, occupied and oppressed in every way you can. And so when there's a Palestinian demonstration or Palestinians pushing back, you don't have to kill everybody. Really, you only have to shoot 1 or 2 people. When the Nakba happened, the Nakba is what Palestinians call a catastrophe. What Jewish people refer to as Jewish Independence Day, the day in 1948 when they finally took their land as they should have and fought back those horrible Arab armies. Palestinians say is the Nakba, the days we had to leave our villages because they would kill us if we didn't. And although there was a lot of denial in Israeli historical society for a long time, a very brave Israeli historian who worked at the university in Haifa, a man named Ilan Pape, researched that, said, you know what, it's true. There were a couple of villages that were completely massacred. And the word went out to all the other villages. If you get in our way, you're next. And then they would randomly perhaps pick 1 or 2 people from each village. Those people would die, the village would leave. And so that's how 750,000 people left their homes because they knew they would die if they didn't. Ilan Pape calls it the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. He's written a very good book about that, and he's documented what's happened. And so it's still a mechanism of control. It's still what happens today in Palestine and in Israel. If you want to control a subject population, pick a few people and let the rest of the population know this is going to happen to them. What's been happening in Jenin lately, where a Palestinian journalist of American citizenship was assassinated by Israel, is happening because some young men from Jenin went into Israel and knife attacked, killed people in Israel. And because they did that, the full brunt of the Israeli military is now on Jenin. First thing they did was go in and destroy the houses that those young men came from. There's collective punishment. They absolutely believe in it, especially in the context of an honor shame culture. You did something from your family, your whole family did it, we're going to wipe out your family, or certainly your family's home. And so we see that playing itself out there. You don't have to get everybody. You just have to disrupt the lives of a few people. And how do you maintain settlements while you're doing that? Well, you build your own roads to settlements. Palestinians aren't allowed on those roads. There's a farm outside of Bethlehem, about 5 minutes drive from Bethlehem, called the Hope Farm, or the Peace Farm. Anyway, it's 5 minutes drive. Well, but the Israelis want that farm. And so what they decided to do was to block the roads going to it. Now it's a half-hour drive if you're Palestinian. If you're Israeli, it's still a 5-minute drive. But Palestinian, it takes you a half hour. You're just not allowed to go the more direct routes. You live in the shadow of the wall. You live in the shadow of a series of rules and regulations that are meant to detract from your ability to live your life. And if you can no longer live your life, then either you will leave or you will stop trying to live it. And it's been very effective. That's a piece of Banksy's art. Now that's definitely what the wall looks like in Bethlehem. It's that big in comparison to the people around it. And this is Banksy saying that, you know, the nativity might look like this. The star being a hole blasted through the wall by something. And this is a young man who's going to tell us a bit about his experience. This is from the No Way to Treat a Child campaign.
اسمع انا بمسك لك اياه وبروح انا عند عمو في صوت خبط باقي طلعت ان الجندي بيصحي فيك بيقول لي قم يا حبيبي تعال معي
كان في مواجهه بعديها رحت اتفرج مع بيت الله بيطلع لي
حتى نزل الدكاتره واول شيء عالجوا الكلب بعدين الامير مسكوه وزتوه في الجيب. دخلنا ورش على المستعمرة قعدت على كنت شايف تحتي بس كان كثر.
بلشت سياسة الضرب يعني في السيارة يخبطوا فيا يعني لدرجة انه وجع.
بلش شلح الواعي بلش فتش الوعية وهذا أنا مشلح طلعت على البوسطة طلعنا في البوسطة وأنا مشلح وليت تقريبا 4 ساعات في البوسطة 4 ساعات يعني تجمدت صرت ثلج الآدم. قعدنا هنا بعدين صار يضرب علي في حجار وكان رايح والجاي يضرب بعد يمكن 5 ساعات جينا وطلعنا عصر.
Yeah, during our short time there, we interviewed the families of 5 children who'd been taken by the Israelis. Usually they do that in the middle of the night. They'll come into the village in Tukwa or some of the other villages, Beit Jafar. They come in about 2 a.m. They come in with about 50 soldiers. The families kind of know it's something's happening because a drone will overfly the neighborhood during the day, just to, I guess, get the latest intelligence, and they'll know that something's happening. There might have been a clash, which is a confrontation between protesters and Israeli military, and the day before that. And often in the clashes, it's young adolescent boys. It's kind of like a rite of passage that are maybe throwing rocks or sometimes maybe Molotov cocktails. I never saw that, but I did see rocks at Israeli soldiers. So they'll take pictures of those kids. I mean, they've been occupying that village for 70 years. They know who the kids are. They've got their pictures. Or they'll have a picture of a kid with a red scarf, and so they'll break into that house where they think that kid is living at 2 o'clock in the morning. They'll either do it very loud with flashbangs on the doors, and most of the doors in Palestine are metal, so they'll blow the door open and disrupt the family in that way, or they'll do it very quietly. They have hydraulic ram devices that will spread the door frame apart. Then they open the door very quietly and they enter into the house, and they're around the parents' beds, usually with their rifles cocked and aimed at them, not rifles, semi-automatic machine guns. And they'll say, where are your children? Give us your children. And then they go to the children's room and they destroy the room. I mean, we saw the rooms, and they take the child. Now, there's a group called Breaking the Silence, former Israeli soldiers, who say they're told by their commanders, it doesn't really matter if you got the right child. It just matters that you got a child. Go in there and get one. What we really want to do is disrupt this community so that this doesn't happen anymore. Go pick one, get one. And then when the child is taken, you saw some of the testimony. That testimony is gathered by an organization called Defense of Children International Palestine. That's one of 6 organizations in Israel that was recently declared to be a terrorist organization by the government of Israel. They say it's because Defense of Children International has, at some point in time, talked to people who Israel has deemed to be terrorists. Now, 70% of the population of Palestine has at one time or another been in an Israeli jail. And anybody who's been in an Israeli jail is a terrorist as far as Israel is concerned. And so Israel has tried to make sure that nobody has anything to do with those terrorists. And they're saying that Defense of Children International, an organization that just tells people what's happening to children in Palestine, not just by the Israelis, but also by the Palestinian Authority, which is not a great organization to deal with either, is a terrorist organization. We shouldn't listen to them anymore. Any funding that goes to them is funding terrorist causes. And so the government of Israel does not want us to hear those stories about those children and what they do to those children. There's another organization you can find online called Military Court Watch. They regularly interview. They track the kids. They find out what's happened to them. They talk to them. And you know, Israel's campaign to disrupt community, much like another campaign in some other country far away, is rooted in the children. If you can go disrupt the children and take the children and destroy their confidence and their sense of themselves as part of a community that can hold them and protect them and look after them, if you can take away their sense of the future of a place that's bright and strong, then you create a despairing child, maybe a 20-year-old who decides to commit suicide by going to knife some people in Israel before he goes. You can do that, and if you do that, that's also a success, because you create the ongoing story of terrorists who are attacking you in your country, and your country needs you to protect them. This just struck me. It was like my second day there. I go to this little village called Kisan. It's a Bedouin community. The Bedouins were driven out of the Negev by Israel very early on in Israel's existence. Most Bedouins are driven out. And so this little village close to Bethlehem, somebody in the Bedouin community had a relative. And so they founded a little community for that extended family. And in Kisan, because it's sort of this more recent community, started in the early 50s, they don't have a lot. It's a very poor place, and people are still earning their income by shepherding and doing what they can to support one another. And they had a small school, and right on the side of the road, which is a road that settlers take to go to land that they're colonizing, that they've taken from this village. There are 2 sea-cans that have been converted into classrooms. And the settlers, of course, attack the children, the sea-cans, and if anybody pushes back, they call the military. And it just struck me, out of all that I'd learned and heard from, you know, World War II and the use of the Star of David as this horrible way of identifying people as a subject people, that Israeli settlers would use the Star of David as graffiti to terrorize Palestinians, just struck me. I couldn't believe they would do that. But I'm not there. I don't have their sensibility, their reason for existing, or what they think they're doing. I don't understand that, but that's what they do. The Star of David is now the sign of terror for Palestinians. It just struck me. Of course, there was a shepherd grazing his sheep in ancestral lands. They've also planted some olive trees there. This particular shepherd had been warned to stay away from this land. The colony wanted it. They didn't want him grazing his sheep there. And when he continued to do that, they first started to roll rocks down on him. I've said how steep those hills are. Rolling rocks down could cause some damage, but he still went out with his sheep. He had a herd of about 50 sheep. So they decided that he wasn't quite getting the lesson, so they brought their dogs to teach him. He was severely mauled by the dogs, in hospital for 6 weeks. He lost 10 of his sheep. And the team that was before me, Team 77, was in relationship with that family and managed to help them get their home rebuilt by a human rights organization. And that shepherd, I think he had 6 kids, 5 girls, 1 boy. And as far as the colonizers are concerned, those people don't belong there. And they surround homes and throw rocks at them and say things like, "Get out of here, this is our land, God gave it to us, what are you doing here?" So resistance, how do people resist? Well, this is a shepherd, another shepherd, resisting. What he's heading towards is an outpost. That's the beginning of a colony. It's a small farmstead that a Jewish settler has put in the middle of Palestine. And if anybody tried to move them out, they would be attacked by the army. So this shepherd is taking his sheep to go graze that land. It's a huge act of resistance thinking about what happened to that shepherd story we just talked about, but he's doing it because he has to do it, because they can't just let this go. But they can't resist with arms, and they can't resist with fists, and they can't resist with protests. So in this case, they're resisting with sheep. This is a Palestinian farmer. I think it was the second day we were there as a team, who called us to ask if we would stand and help while they replanted olive trees that had been cut down 12 years before by settlers who were in a colony just above the hills of his farm. When his brother tried to resist that, they imprisoned his brother for 3 years. His brother's daughter tried to be part of the resistance. She was 15, she got 6 months. And 12 years later, we were there to help them replant those trees. And it's thick, heavy clay soil. I mean, it looks like it should be loose and kind of sandy with all that limestone in it, but holy cow, it's really hard to dig in. After a while, they let me stop trying to dig, and I only had to plant the trees, which was a bonus because I was just about done. That first picture you saw of me in the other video, they had prepared chicken for us and kebabs. It was just the best meal ever, but the other 3 members of my team were all vegetarian. So I ate, a lot of chicken. I was feeling pretty good, and then they brought the kebabs out. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with those. So anyway, I did it. People resist in different ways in their own culture, in their own time. In Jerusalem, we met some people. This is a woman, a Jewish Israeli woman, who is resisting heavily, not colonization. She kind of thinks they need to do that to keep her safe, but the structures of her time. She really doesn't like it at all that a lot of life in Israel is controlled by Orthodox rabbis who set up rules and regulations that control her life. And so she spent a lot of her life fighting that through Israeli courts and Israeli systems. Interesting to talk to her and hear from her. These are 2 women, one whose 2 brothers were killed by the occupation, one whose son was an Israeli soldier in Lebanon who was killed there. They've started a families connecting group, and they meet and they see one another as human beings. And in that group, they get together, they have picnics, they have conversations. They're trying to find a way to humanize one another so that the struggles stop. This fellow was a Haredi, Orthodox Jewish man raised in Haredi community, who isn't part of the community anymore, but he took us on tours and told us a bit about the ultra-Orthodox community and how they're engaged and what's happening. I had lots of stories from him, and the one that strikes me the most is that in that ultra-Orthodox community, the men are supposed to study. That's what they do. They study and they pray. They learn about Torah, they study and they pray, and they do that every day. And the state initially supported them, but there's a lot of controversy in Israel about whether or not you should just support religious Jews, because most of Israel, despite the fact saying that this is the land God gave to us, most of Israel is secular. They're not Jewish, they're not religious. They don't like the idea of supporting these religious people. And so the state support has dropped off, and that's meant that the wives in the Haredi families have had to go out and work. And so he was telling us that because the women are now the economic support of the families, the whole power dynamic in that family relationship is shifting and changing. And it was just kind of remarkable to think about all the stuff that goes on in people's lives when economic standards, and wondering about that shift and that change in those families. This is another organization, the Palestine Museum of Natural History. It's run by a man who was a geneticist in the States for 50 years, Mazem Kumsieh. You can find them. He's got great stories about the history of the place, about 12,000 years of Palestinian history. Israel is one of its main statements and claims to legitimacy is that there was nobody here when we got here. It was like it was empty. And we were a land for a people without a land kind of thing. But there were people there for thousands of years. I mean, clearly, like, it's where our stories are based. But what Mazem Kumsieh has done is kind of traced it and tracked it and provided the historical proofs for it. He's got videos on YouTube. And he's also talking a lot about the Israeli attempt to impose a monoculture on what really has been quite a varied cultural experience as people have moved through there. And not only a monoculture in terms of culture, but also just in the way they approach it. All the stuff you hear about making the desert bloom, really, it's nuts. It's a horrible way to try and work with a fairly arid countryside. What they've done to attract Europeans, because they need Europeans to come and colonize that land, is tried to create communities that look like, I don't know, you might have just dropped in on a Toronto suburb or something like that. So that means sprinklers, green lawns, sports fields, two-story houses, or you know, even if they're tenements, it looks a lot like something that you could feel comfortable in if you just arrived there from Chicago or Toronto or someplace. But if you look at the countryside, it's been terraced by people for thousands of years to take advantage of whatever might be there in terms of natural rain or natural moisture. People have dug the hillsides in terraces and planted them with olive trees and grapevines and trees and plants that survive in that naturally arid territory. And what you do when you try and bring water in to a territory like that is you establish an artificial relationship that can't survive, it can't live, but you're also killing off the parts of the land and the environment that can survive, that did make sense. And you know, I don't have to look very far to think, what are we doing here in our own communities that might mirror some of that? This is from a refugee camp in Bethlehem. You can't really see it, but those are all the villages that those people came from, and they are planning on returning. And you can go to a shop there, a souvenir shop, and get a key of return. Everybody kept their household keys, and they look like great big skeleton keys. They kept them so they could return to their villages one day. Of course, their villages are long gone, but they still hold the keys because the key is a promise of survival, a place where they might make it. And so because they have those keys, sometimes the families leave. And when they left their keys behind, and you can buy one in the key of return shop, and I did. I just bought one because it reminded me of people holding on to their place in their villages. But they also do incredible work with smoke bomb canisters, tear gas canisters, and sound grenade canisters. They make incredible jewelry out of them, and they sell them too. There's a big supply of them because the Ada camp is a camp. It's a fairly big camp, and the Israeli military, now this is in the heart of Bethlehem, in a place that's supposed to be 100% controlled by Palestine, both civilly and militarily and police-wise, and the Israeli military goes in there anytime they want to, and they break into houses, and they go after kids. They do what they can to disrupt life and community there. They target the 3 refugee camps in Bethlehem more than they target the rest of Bethlehem, but it's still not at all unusual in Bethlehem to see the Israeli military patrolling through, stopping and checking people and demanding that they provide their ID. Now, there's also a civil disobedience happening in Jerusalem. We're in this great cafe. I think it was called the Mbala Cafe. It's established by the LGBTQ2S community who are tired of being pinkwashed, they said. They said one of the things that Israel likes to say is that it's a real safe place if you're not hetero. And they said that's absolute crap. It's not great, it's not safe, but that we can band together as community here. And one of the things that they do is send observers out into Palestine, especially around olive harvest season, so that they can confront the settlers who are trying to disrupt olive harvest. And so these folks who know quite clearly what it's like to be persecuted and terrorized in the context of your own community are expanding their resistance to help Palestinians as well. They're really great people to meet. One of them, a fellow that I talked to, was a guy from Toronto, and we just had good conversation about what's happening and the strength it takes to stay in that. I mean, I was there for 3 months. Well, not even that. And they're there. They've made a committed decision to be there. This is a woman that, this is one of my fellow EAs, Charlotte. She's from Germany. And a woman that we talked to for quite a while is the head of her family. That's rare in Palestine, but she is. She's a very strong personality. Her household was, her home was destroyed by the Israeli military many years ago. They said her brother was a terrorist. He's still in prison, and she's been fighting ever since to try and help her family maintain some way of being. And when everybody else said at some point, we think we could probably live with Israelis because it's only one state that's left for us now. There's just nothing left of our own state. We're going to have to live together in one state. She was more like, nah, I don't think so. She was more on of the opinion that many Israelis, especially the colonizers, are only there because they're subsidized. And she said, as soon as they have to pay what we have to pay to live here, they're gone. She said, they'll go back to their home countries. They have no commitment to this land. They only want what they can get. She's a very interesting woman to talk to. I went to a demonstration in Bethlehem. I mean, it's Bethlehem. The Trump plan came out. You know Trump's plan? It was like, okay, you can have a bunch of Bantu stands, and then we'll connect them by tunnels. That's it. Everything else goes to Israel. And so that plan came out, and people were like, should we protest? I mean, really, it was Trump. the guy's an idiot. And most people, there were like 400 people in this protest, and they walked towards Ida Camp. And I was there taking pictures. And then the smoke grenades and the tear gas and the sound bombs went off, and they just came walking back. A few of the young people stayed to throw rocks at the military. It was like a rite of passage for them. But you can't demonstrate. You cannot demonstrate. You can't protest the occupation in any part of Palestine or Israel for that matter. If you do, you're going to be attacked. You'll be shot. You'll be killed. Not all of you, some of you. Many of you will be shot in the head with rubber bullets. And it sounds innocuous, but that's just a coating around steel. You get shot in the head with a rubber bullet. Brain damage is probably your best outcome. There have been people who have been blinded and people who have been brain damaged and people who've been killed by that. These are Palestinians who are in the world, in the diaspora in the world, in different cities, capital cities around the world. They were Palestinian leaders, Palestinian men. They're no longer amongst the living. Israel is very proud of hunting down Palestinian leaders wherever they can find them and shooting them, assassinating them. And there's no apologies. They said that these people are after us. We'll kill them wherever we find them, and our governments are silent. Those are the soldiers that were waiting for the demonstration. This is the Mewar Center. It's a center that's run and established by Palestinian women because there's a lot of gender violence in Palestine. It's a patriarchal culture. It's run in a hierarchical way. And women are determined to change that and to change the way that their culture treats women who are caught in domestic violence situations. This center is funded by the government of Israel, Italy, and built on an Italian models on how people can live in relationship. Stop the violence is what that says. And this is, I think, my last little video. Maybe I'll skip this one. Yeah, let's just skip it. It's also on the Independent Jewish Voices website. These are some of the organizations, just some. There are many organizations. Maxim Watch is an organization of Jewish Israeli grandmothers who go out to checkpoints in any place where they can see that Palestinians are being mistreated, and they challenge their grandchildren. Most people in the Israeli military are 19, 20, 21. They've been raised all their lives to think that they're going to protect their people from the enemy. When their grandmother's saying, this is who you are, it changes things for them. These women are determined women, most of them in their 80s, and they just turn up. And they said when they were doing it in the second Intifada, it really freaked their grandchildren out because they thought that they'd be in some danger. And they said, no, this is not who we are. The one woman that we interviewed said, I do this in part for Palestinians, but in main, she said, I do this for us. She said, we're not the country that we've had to become to be occupiers. This is not who we were meant to be, and it's not who we are. And we're never going to change until we stop being occupiers. And that's who I'm doing this for. Church of Scotland is very engaged in resistance, but it's very interesting resistance. I was in Tiberias, which is a resort community built around the time of Herod Antipas for Romans to go have a little resort experience on the shores of Galilee. I went there. It's now a place where it's almost entirely populated by Jewish Israeli people. All the Palestinian population were driven out into surrounding villages or elsewhere. And the Church of Scotland owned a hospital there, but because it's now part of Israel, they didn't need to run a hospital there anymore. So they opened up a luxury hotel. I thought, that's an interesting choice to make. They did it so that they could be part of what's now a resort community to live fully into that context. And they hired their staff who's half Palestinian and half Jewish Israeli, and they have weekly meetings about how we're going to do this work together and who we are, where we came from, how we are in relationship. And they're resisting the thread, the story that they're all terrorists and they're all abusers, and building a new story and a new reality by actively resisting in that way. And Church of Scotland is doing that kind of resistance in many places. People in Haifa, we met with families in Haifa who were really like Jewish Israeli families, part of a Reform congregation. We talked to them, and they said, they talked about needing desperately leaders who would allow them to dream again, because they didn't feel like they had any dreams left. They just had choices between what was bad and what was worse in terms of their elections. B'Tselem, a human rights group, Breaking the Silence, former military people, the Good Shepherd Collective, you can find them online. They're in Palestine filming stuff that's going on. Yesh Din, a human rights organization that's engaged in taking the Israeli government to court, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Jewish Fast for Gaza here, Jewish Voices for Peace. A Jewish organization called Committee Against Home Demolition. They go and try and stop homes from being demolished by the government of Israel wherever they find that, and then they help rebuild them. They've only rebuilt, they said, about 50 out of tens of thousands, but they say each one is, for them, it's a statement in the other direction. So that's some of what I saw, some of what other people have to say. And I've been talking for a long time. I'm going to stop now and ask if anybody has any questions.
Okay. Do you want, say, a series of questions, 3 questions, or do you want a question one at a time and you'll answer it and then go on to another? What do you think is better in terms of disciplining you in the amount of time that we have left?
Right.
Yeah.
I'll be very short with my answers. So
Okay.
if somebody has a question,
I'm simply just going to try to note who has hands up, and then I would ask anyone to keep their comments and questions brief if possible. And I won't call on anyone to speak more than once unless no one else wants to speak at that time. So,
Yep.
Okay, I was just wondering about what when you were in Palestine, because I'm just wondering about with the Israel has 5 they need 5 shots to maintain their vaccine passport.
Right.
So I'm just wondering about how that has, and I understand too that Palestinians are not very willing to get vaccines as well. So.
Okay, so I was there in January and February of 2020, just before COVID hit. Bethlehem was shut down by the Israelis March 6th, I think, of 2020, and then we were moved out. There is a team in there now, and I think they're under Canadian vaccine protocols, which are 3 vaccines. I hadn't heard. I mean, I wouldn't doubt that Palestinians are very suspicious of anything Israel's giving them. Israel at one point in the pandemic said that they were going to give Palestinians free access to vaccines, and it turned out that they were all expired vaccines. You know, it's from the government perspective in Israel, if they all died of the pandemic, so be it. And from the Palestinian perspective, if the Israelis have anything that they're willing to give you, question it heavily. So I'm not sure what they did was say the vaccines they got from Russia or from parts of Europe. I'm not sure how that worked out.
From Judy Goldschmidt, what are the expectations or qualities of a person from the diaspora that chooses to witness in Palestine?
Okay, so the United Church of Canada is looking for more EAPPI people. We promised the World Council of Churches we'd supply people, and there are openings right now. I don't know, reasonably decent health. There's a lot of walking. Bethlehem somewhat, but there are other places where you're out with shepherds all the time. Reasonably well grounded in your perspective on the world and your perhaps your faith, although the 3 young women that I was with were not from churches. They're sponsored by churches in Norway, Sweden, and Germany. But they're pretty well-grounded people. They had a good perspective on the world and who they were in it. And there are questions, right? And there's a psychological test. And so they're not going to just let you go without being sure that you're the kind of person that can do the witnessing. And I'll tell you, it's not so much the witnessing, it's because you see all of this stuff. It's actually the dynamic between team members who come from different places and different life perspectives and have to try and figure all this stuff out very suddenly. That's more what the church is looking at. But yeah, there are opportunities. So if you'd like to go, it's 3 months normally, and there's a stipend that you receive and free accommodation and food. So
is it a 1 state or 2 state?
When we first went there, we were addressed by a member of the Middle Eastern Council of Churches from the Palestinian Church, and he had said that they had supported 2 state, but now they feel 1 state is probably the only way to go. And they're looking more at constitutional guarantees for Jewish people, much like in Canada, so they could maybe do a notwithstanding out of the Constitution. If it looked like they were feeling they were affected, they could exercise a notwithstanding. I mean, we've seen that happen in Quebec, where they basically put in a notwithstanding that affects the human rights of their own citizens. They thought that there may be some way to do constitutional guarantees within the context of one state. They definitely want, once that one of the school principals, their kids in Kisan are being run over, like 7 kids in the last 7 months, run over by Israeli settlers speeding through the village because they don't want to get stoned, maybe, or maybe because they don't feel like they're people. Who knows really what's going on? But they don't have a good transit system at all in a little village like that. But the settlement has a Greyhound bus equivalent that runs through that village with 2 people on it every day going into Jerusalem or someplace. And he just looked at that and said, why couldn't we just, like he said, you know, they have great roads, they have a great transportation system, their government is less corrupt than ours. It's still corrupt, but ours is more corrupt. Like, we could do such wonderful things if we were together as one people in this land. So many people there see that one state is something that they think they could work with. And I think most ordinary people, they just, you know, they just want to go to work, feed their kids, know that they have a safe place. So how can they make those guarantees? That's what I heard when I was there.
We're gonna, for 1 second, we're gonna try a little technology before we get to this question.
Okay.
Judy at home, you want to turn and unmute and make that comment, Judy?
Thank you. Keith, so nice to see you. Thank you for Zooming this today, so some of us could participate without driving there. I have a lot of emotional feelings about the idea of going and witnessing, as important as I think it is. So I really feel like, you know, besides our lobbying efforts within Canada, that we should be really making efforts to fund sending those younger people with more stamina. I mean, a lot of us are retired. I can't, you know, what it would cost for us to go for 2 weeks. Maybe some of us could contribute that, you know, or not for 2 weeks, for 3 months. I mean, whatever program it is. There's also the Jewish Center for Nonviolence that is sending young Jewish people from the diaspora to witness. So, yeah. I did have another question, but I'll wait.
I mean, the church does fund, and there are different ways for people to go on tours, and that's what we're trying to encourage through the United Church, people to go on come and see tours for 2 weeks or around that. We did send a delegation of young people over as a church at the time when I was there in, I think, February 2020. And you know, the plane that I went over on, there was a group of young Jewish people from the Toronto area, but it was a completely different idea, right? It was a birthright tour. The government of Israel certainly funds thousands of young Jewish people to go there and see it from that perspective. So it is something that, yeah, I think the more people that get there to see it for themselves, there are millions of people that go there every year, and they get on a bus and they go to Bethlehem and they don't see it, right? They go and they see the Church of the Nativity, and then they get back on the bus and go back to Jerusalem. So it would be good somehow to get more input into those places. Now, you had a, yeah.
Could you speak about the right to return and the millions of Palestinians still living in refugee camps?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Yeah, there are like, I forget how many million now, 7 million. So the United Nations guaranteed that people who are refugee from a conflict like this one, and particularly this one, would have the right to return to their homes. And Israel totally disagrees with that, because they would see themselves overwhelmed demographically if those Palestinians and their descendants came back. But it's still a right. It's an international right, and it's on the table with negotiations. If you're going to have one state, then we have to do that with people having the right to decide whether or not they want to return. There's lots of opinion about whether or not everybody would return. People are established, but there are certainly people who have been living in refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan, Syria, who would probably want to return. But the government of Israel says the only people who have a right to return to Israel are anybody who is declared to be Jewish in the world. The Palestinians don't have the right to return in any way at any time. So it's contentious. And demographically, the Palestinians are already beaten the Israelis in terms of birth rate. 70% of Palestinians are under 30, so they're already worried about that. Yeah.
I heard from a Christian bishop in the States that the one state or two state solution is an issue for the Palestinians to decide, not for the international community. What we have to oppose is the apartheid practice, not get involved in whether it's one state or two states. But the problem that I have sometimes in my mind is boycott, because I happily go to Nanaimo once a month or so with a sign saying boycott apartheid Israel. And then next day I see complaints about United States boycotting Venezuela. And so it's boycotting is it's a coercive action. And then I feel, well, it's necessary, but then how come it's necessary for them and not for boycotting Russia, or boycotting other countries? So boycott is a very, very difficult proposition in my mind. And I wonder if we did boycott, or if we didn't proclaim boycott apartheid Israel, then what do we do?
Yeah, well, boycotts have certainly been successful in the past. Yeah. So it's the time we said it would be, 3:29 just about. So if there are any. Yeah.
Sorry, Jeff, can I get this mic on again? Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say with regard to Ian's question, comment about boycotting, in my mind, I immediately distinguish between individuals and groups attempting to boycott particular products and particular companies and so on, and between a reference to, let's say, boycotting of Venezuela or boycotting of Russia. These aren't boycotts. These are, in fact, the S in the BDS. These are sanctions.
Oh, right.
And as has been clear to me for years, sanctions can be carried out by governments. I can't impose sanctions on some other country. I can only decide to boycott and or to disinvest, to pull my money out of certain things, for example, to criticize a pension plan for how that money is invested, or what a church does with its investments and so on. By the way, the question much earlier about access to vaccines, utterly clear to me that Israel is opposed to anything which in any way might benefit Palestinians. And so as an occupying power, it legally, immediately on occupying another people, has responsibility for the welfare of those people. Israel does the absolute opposite. It tries to basically persecute those people and, if possible, drive them out or wipe them out. So there has been next to nothing in terms of providing vaccines to Palestinians, but there has been something for Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. And that, I think, was only after a certain amount of pressure. But if you're a Jewish Israeli, you'll get the best medical science.
Yeah, the apartheid, I think that's the point I didn't emphasize enough, is that if you're not Jewish Israeli, if you're what they call Arab Israeli, then you have a whole different standard of living and a whole different series of rights. When that video talked about a Jewish state, it's as more and more, I don't know, right-wing politicians start to take control in Israel, that becomes more and more lived out in terms of how they see policies for people who are Jewish and people who aren't. But the other side of boycott, of course, is support. Right? I mean, we're also trying to figure out ways to support. So in our church, we started many years ago with fair trade coffee and fair trade chocolate to say we need to support those farmers. It's not enough to say that NABOB is, hurting people, or the World Monetary Fund is telling people they have to grow coffee instead of food crops. Let's find ways to support people on the ground. And so we have supported Palestinian farmers. We have Zatoun oil, olive oil here in this church, and Zatoun spices, and we can't keep enough Zatoun soap. So, when we have it, we have it. And we also have carvings from Bethlehem, and we have hand-blown glass from Hebron. And yeah, Jeff says we have some crosses from Bethlehem. So, and we have little sheep that are made in the L'Arche community in Bethlehem. They're just things that we try and bring over so that One, it supports the carvers there. They get some income from us, and that's what's keeping them going, especially the last 2 years with no tourists running through Bethlehem. But the other thing is that if you take a piece of that away, then what you take with you is a story. It's carved out of olive wood, or it's blown from the sand of the Holy Land. It comes from that place where this story is still being lived out. It's not an old story and an ancient story. It's a living story right now. It's a story about resisting through love, resisting through supporting one another, resisting horrible and awful oppression that, you know, I as a Christian might read and say, well, that happened 2,000 years ago. And how did that get resisted? It got resisted helplessly. It got resisted by people saying, I have nothing but the people around me. I am nothing unless people come together in love and hold and care and support. And so that's still going on, that story in Bethlehem, in the land that we call holy, in Israel and Palestine. And the ways that we can support one another, we can offer to resist the meta narrative that the powerful control everything and the weak are powerless, and offer ways to extend our relationship directly. Oh.
We also have a message from
Fayaz and Mona, yes. So one of the ways of resisting over there is amazing. So I met this family on my Covenant Sea tour, and then when I went back as an EA in a place called Tulkarm. Tulkarm is, if you get up to the hills on Tulkarm, you can see Tel Aviv. You're not allowed to go there because there's a wall, but you can see it. Tulkarm is a place where the government of Israel has designated for chemical plants and factories to produce because they can't have those factories in Israel. They violate their own environmental regulations, but they put them into Palestine and Tulkarm. Tulkarm's cancer rates are higher than anywhere else in Israel now with these chemical factories there. And they situated them right beside a farm. And then they built the wall through about half of that farm. So you have this little farm that's sandwiched between chemical factories and the wall. And the farmer there, the farm family there, decided that they would put most of it in greenhouses and that they would refuse to support the system that's oppressing them. And the farmer, Fayaz, said to us, he said, it's not the Israelis. He said, I don't really want you to think that this is all about the Israelis. I mean, he said, it is them. He said, but they're just tools. He didn't mean like tool, like I would mean tool. He just meant they're tools. He said, they're tools of the world corporate capitalist system that's milking us all like cows, he said. And as long as we lay claim to the role of being cows within that system, we will be. So I refuse to participate in that system. And that's how he resists. He's an off-grid farmer. He doesn't buy water from Israel. He's built huge cisterns under his farm, which has been bulldozed 3 times during the Second Intifada. He has all of these greenhouses. He doesn't buy fertilizer from the chemical factory that's polluting his land. He buys goat dung from his neighbors, and they mix that up into manure teas, and they inject that into the water system that goes to his crops. And because it creates methane gas, he uses that to drive his generators. And he raises koi fish in ponds, and out of those ponds, he pumps the water through eaves troughs, and the eaves troughs have tomato plants that live off the nutrient from those fish. And then, of course, the fish are protein. He uses solar energy to run the little computer fans that keep the nurseries going, and he doesn't buy seed from Monsanto. He saves 25% of his seed, and he replants every year with that seed, just like his mother taught him, he said. And so Fayaz he's just like, and he said, you know, it's his nuts. He said, of course, it makes no sense at all to be an organic farmer in Palestine. Like you just don't get it back. But he said, it doesn't make sense to be anything else. And he really wants to travel the world. He does. He gets out to Europe a fair bit and to Ireland and just talk to people who are also resisting in that way, refusing to feed the beast that controls us all, finding ways to get off the grids and stop participating in the mechanisms of control that have evolved in our world, in our daily lives, and doing something different by refusing and resisting in a way that you can only resist if you're a Palestinian farmer. So he's coming. We think, we were hoping he was coming in June, but the visa process was interrupted by a mass deportation of people elsewhere in the world. And so we're hoping we can get him here in September. And he'll be in Toronto for a while, in Winnipeg for a while, and on the island for a while. And on the island, I want him to meet as many organic off-grid people as I can, because he wants to learn stuff. He wants to share information. And I thought it's a great place. It's not necessarily a natural community of contact, you know, Palestinians and organic farmers, but it should be, because the narrative is similar. And I also want to get him out to Tofino just so he can see Cathedral Grove and the Pacific, because he should, if he's here in Canada, at least see a bit of that. So that's our hope. In September, the visa goes through. Our government's not really all that friendly around visas around Palestinians, but we're hopeful that we'll meet the requirements. He's being sponsored by the United Church of Canada in some ways, so we hope that'll make a bit of a difference. So yeah, thanks. A sign of hope.
Two quick things. Judy was asking, is this farmer on the internet?
Yeah, it's the Tanib farm, Herkutna farm, I think it's called, but look for Fayaz and Mona Tanib, and you'll find all kinds of stories about them on the internet.
Okay, second point was from someone else, Nathan, saying that in the idea of supporting Palestinians, there's also olive oil available at the community farm store.
Right.
Called Zatoun olive oil.
Yeah, same oil that we sell here. Yeah, community
here.
farm store in different places. Any other questions? No? Let's see. What else do we have? If I had a hammer. What's that? Oh, from Howard's Inn. So this I found in Mazim Kums's website, actually. Mazim likes Howard's Inn a lot. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. And I think that is true. And I think of all the people I met who are behaving magnificently in Palestine and in Israel, there's so much hope. And here too. And yeah, I think that's a good note.
I think I'm being invited to
Close.
thank you, Keith, and to say that I guess we've come to the end of our time.
I think we have.
I did want to say, since you have such a marvelous display just outside the door, if people have some time, if there's anything they'd like to pick up and make a contribution, or actually buy if it's something that has a price on it, are you perhaps going to be around for a
Sure,
few
I'll
minutes
hang
after?
out there. There's
Sure.
also some postcards from the No Way to Treat a Child campaign to try and there are legislators in the States and in Canada. We're finding that's an entry point, that you can challenge Israel on what they're doing to children. I mean, they might see it as natural and logical, but apparently we repudiated that in Canada. And so participating in that campaign and letting our government know that we don't want Canadian funds to support the torture and persecution of Palestinian children might be a way to do that. There's some information there about that. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Well, should we sing the last one? Did you want to see that? What do you want to sing? We Shall Overcome? If I Had a Hammer. Okay, so just so you know, this song, Where the Fraser River Flows, was written by Joe Hill when he came up to support some folk who were on strike in the Canadian Railway strike in the Fraser River. But why don't we sing this one? You probably know that one. If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, all over this land. I hammer out danger, I hammer out warning, I hammer out love between the brothers
a song. I'd sing it in the morning. I'd sing it in the evening. All over this land. I'd sing out of danger. I'd sing out a warning. I'd sing out love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land. Well, I got a hammer and I got a bell. I got a song to sing all over this land. It's the hammer of justice. It's the bell of freedom. It's a song about love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land.